So see, you're not like, this isn't a sales pitch for absolute God. It's a test. Okay, so your number 1, based on number 9, is the most implausible idea of God, which is absolute God. So you're going to write down a bunch of characteristics that constitute absolute God. Now, in the rest of it, you're going to be testing for whether your construct and definition of absolute God is really absolute. And then, of course, if you've really proven that it really is absolute, then if you get into anything that disproves the absoluteness of God, whoa, then you've hit the jackpot. You with me? So we're going to go start again. I won't, run around so much. Number 9 was, if every other explanation is proven impossible, then the only remaining one, however implausible, is correct. So you pick the most implausible idea of God as your definition in number 1, creating, as it were, the face of someone you know and can recognize. And with God being invisible, because absolute, you're going to have to create a set of attributes. Righteousness, justice, law. All those things are invisible. Okay, but they're invisible, but if this God really exists and created everything, it's going to be somehow a reflection of what you can't see. Right? So number 1 is you create these attributes of absolute God. Omniscience, justice, righteousness, love, omnipresence, omnipotence. You can talk around about what those attributes ought to be. Okay, so then we get to number 2 in symbolic criteria. There's evidence of absence of this God, we're now going to say absolute God, if there is a better explanation. Okay, what would better have to mean? Well, what's the scientific idea of a better theory? A better theory, and the same thing is true in philosophy for a better explanation. A better explanation, a better theory, is one that explains the same facts better. In other words, it accounts for them better. It's an accounting. It's a better accounting. In some accountings or some explanations of God, there's all these questions that are left out. There are a lot of contradictions and stuff. Okay, so then that doesn't necessarily mean that God doesn't exist, but it does mean that the explanation's not good enough. So then you have to go back to the drawing board. Okay, so if evidence present suggests a better explanation than you're answering, then you have to go back to the drawing board and revisit your definition of absolute God in number 1. You with me? So you see how number 2 is functioning as a process of elimination and helps you hone down whether or not your definition of absolute God is really absolute. Okay, so if you're passing number 2, when evidence suggests a better explanation than the one you're coming up with, if number 2 is passed, then you got another little hurdle that this definition of absolute God has to pass in order to prove it exists. Okay, number 3 in Symbolic's list was evidence of something else being present. Now, when he said something else, he meant something that would negate. Alright? And the example that he gave was sort of like mutual exclusivity, or two things rarely being found together. So if you're saying, okay, God is absolute love, I mean, why be God, not love? So that's a really important attribute to pick. Okay, what's rarely found together with absolute love? And if you keep on finding it, then either your idea of love is wrong, or there's no absolute God of love. Okay, you see how effective this could be? And of course, mutual exclusivity. Absolute love does not go with absolute hate. And that was the example that in the second video, Veritas, that Cimbolic was coming up with. And absolutely hating God, even if God, by all other definitions, you just hope that definition of God doesn't really exist. That would, mutual hate and mutual love are mutually exclusive. Okay? Absolute hate and absolute love are mutually exclusive. So see, you got something you can test there. So that was number 3. Evidence of something else being present, which the idea is that something else is rarely found in combination with this definition of God you're using in number 1, or it's mutually exclusive to the definition of God you're using in number 1. Alright. Number 4 on his list when the thing being sought is found somewhere else and cannot be in two places at once. Now this 4, 5, and 6 are the three most important criteria for ferreting out whether God exists, especially absolute God. Let me explain why. If there is a God who is absolute, the only way that absoluteness is going to have any teeth, going to really be absolute, is if that God is righteous, aka holy, aka just. Okay, so justice and injustice cannot be in two places at once. Alright? You can have an injustice that justice acts on. That's not being in two places at once. That's a sequence. Alright? But you couldn't have the mutual coexistence of injustice and justice. And I don't really want to step on any toes, but I'm going to have to. If you posit a single absolute God, you do violate number 4 right away. Because if there is a single absolute God, and that would mean that absolute God is himself holy. But a single absolute God cannot pay himself for sin. Okay, if I sin, I'm human. I'm too small. There's not a doggone thing I can do. I'd have to become God to pay God at God's level. I can't do that, and I'm a sinner to boot. So everything I do is doo-doo. Got that? So if there's only one God who's absolute, whether you're talking about the top of a pantheon, or you're talking about so-called monotheism in any of the major flavors, so this steps on a lot of toes. Okay? If that God isn't getting paid for sin by some other God who's equal, well, then you got injustice and justice in the same place at the same time, unrequited justice, because the injustice can't be atoned for, can't be paid for. Alright, you with me on that? So that's being in two places at once. That's number 4. Now, that ends up eliminating a whole lot of concepts of absolute God right there. The most important idea you get from that is, oh, wait a minute. If absolute God exists and is holy, there can't just be one. Because who's going to pay absolute God? Alright? And I'll explain more about that here in number 5. When the evidence which is present is contrary. That was number 5 on Cymbolic's list. When the evidence which is present is contrary. Now, what's the evidence which is present that's contrary to absolute God? Us. And there are billions of us. It's not like you can treat it as a statistical anomaly, okay? We all get mad at windows, or at traffic, or at the bathtub when we stub our toe on it. Okay, well, getting mad is a sin. Alright? I can't tell you how many times a day I get mad. Okay, the evidence present is that I get mad, and the evidence alleged is that there's this absolute God. Okay, well, if there's just this one absolute God, only one, then the evidence present is that my sinning against this God cannot be requited to that God at all.